My name is Liam Wickham, and I am the founder of game-production.com, where we seek to enable games industry professionals to plan better, lead better, and stop the crunch culture through building a community of support, knowledge, and training. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're keeping things much more informal than I would normally do, where I do an intro and this sort of stuff. So, Callum Godfrey, who was our first podcast guest, he proposed that a few of us get together and start talking around the topics of the difference between traditional game production and the making of products, so more mobile-based type game production, perhaps, if you want to call it that, and just having a chat around that. And in order to argue with him, we brought on Anil, who's we all worked together at Wargaming, so we were all there at a similar time, and I think I left first. And then who left after me? They probably sacked you, didn't they, Callum?
I was next.
No, they've seen in different countries multiple times. I think it was Keeling after you, wasn't it?
Probably, yeah. So anyway, as I said, we're going to keep it more informal rather than me doing intros. I'd like if you guys could just talk a little bit. Maybe you, Anil, first, because you're new to the whole thing. So give us a bit about your background, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm the fraud that's turned up on game production, trying to pretend like I know something about it. So my name is Anil Das-Gupta. I am actually a co-founder at a mobile game startup where I'm the chief product officer, whatever fancy title you want to give yourself. But in the past, I've worked on sort of both console and mobile games. I worked for Capcom. I've worked on games like Street Fighter, Devil May Cry, Resident Evil. I was kind of Capcom fanboy growing up, so super lucky to have worked on that. Then transitioned into mobile, working on free-to-play titles. And I'm one of the sort of authors and partners at Deconstruct for Fun, which is a blog. A little plug for that blog, but we talk about free-to-play gaming, and I think that's been one of the biggest sort of revolutions in the games industry over the last sort of 10, 15 years, is how games have become live services and how you can keep a game going for years. I look at the example of League of Legends. So yeah, I guess right now I'm foolishly, or I don't know, maybe dreamfully, have started my own startup with some other people. We're making mobile games. We're based in London, and we're trying to live that dream and try and become the next Supercell. Should be easy, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Good luck to you, man.
Yeah, and talking of giving up your day job, Callum.
Yes. Similar to Anil, actually. I've recently jacked in my job as head of production at an established video game studio, and just got the entrepreneurial itch. It's time to go out there and see what's out there. Already hitting those wonderful founder CEO hurdles, in that my co-founder, unfortunately due to COVID, has had to pull out of becoming a co-founder. He lost a family member and has had to make some life choices now.
God, sorry, man.
So I'm literally one man showing it for now until I can find some other idiots willing to put their lives on the line with me.
Right. Here we are.
Yeah.
Hang on. So just so we can frame this a little bit. So Callum, you suggested the idea that we get together and talk about the differences and overlaps between production and product. Do you want to frame that a little bit more? Do you want to say why would we talk about that?
Of course. And this is a good topic, actually, because you guys will know as well as anybody, having done both the respective roles of producer and product owner, the blur between those two roles is getting ever more increased, right? You've got producers who are product people who are producers. We all play part-time designer in our two different respective disciplines sometimes. And with Liam's website being very much about helping people understand what production is and how they can get into production in some people's cases, I figured it would be a good conversation to have with an established product guru like yourself, Anil, myself and Liam as kind of seasoned veterans of the production world, and just thrash out, what are the differences, what are the similarities, where are there overlaps, how we can work best together as two different disciplines, how we respect each other, and help give those new people to the production sphere a bit of a guiding light on what product is and how production is and how we should be best friends.
Thank you. That's a very good overview.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds easy,
we end up
right?
hating each other in about 10 minutes. I've clearly gotten this wrong.
I'm going to give a different bit of background than you. You've said it nice and theoretically. Let me give you sort of a practical example of this. So I've worked in plenty of places where as Anil was saying, live service has become all the thing, right? And the long tail of a game has now become more like how long can we keep a community growing and going on a game and DLC, etc. And we started to see more and more producers who may have worked on traditional PC console games, who have as a producer had some kind of creative input, have had leadership, have had teams to look after, schedules to look after, and have done that from the perspective of, we're going to make a game for a few years. Let's say it's a big game. We're going to make it for a few years. We're going to, at the end of that, finally show it to somebody and hope they buy it and like it. Coming from the way the industry is changing, but coming from software development, and let's face it, that's where true product management, product ownership comes from, is software development and Agile, Scrum, and all those sort of things. Coming from that background as well, which I have, you're speaking a different language. And I think this is why this afternoon could be quite interesting with you guys talking, because that different language is, rather than creating a game from scratch and hoping somebody likes it in a few years, you're looking at a vision for a product, and you're looking at getting that product out to people as soon as humanly possible in, say, the mobile arena.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's software development. Yeah. You're coming in from a business perspective and you're looking at dollars. But when you're making a PC console game, traditionally, you're looking at people who have grown up going, making games is something you do from your heart. And you're not doing that with mobile, in my opinion. From mobile, you are proper business-driven product ownership, right?
Savage there, Liam, but okay.
Well, I think it's a really interesting topic to talk about, and it's a good job that you interjected. Over to you.
I think you do sweep a lot of. You make a very general statement there, Liam, with the mobile is a very cynical business-oriented thing. I think it is more that way than console and PC, certainly. Let's not forget there are exceptions to every rule. There are always going to be mobile games that are very much, done because it's a passion project, or done because we want to make great games on that platform and leverage the things that platform can do that console and PC can't. I think mobile definitely has more people who are business oriented in that space, and console is definitely transitioning that way, which is an interesting thing we should segue into later, because I do see console and PC now moving to be more operationally like mobile titles, in that they have product people and they have people thinking about long-term systems and services. But let's not make the mistake of kind of making the statement that all mobile games are just ruthless money grabbing things that are intended to open your wallet.
I mean, Anil has not had the chance to actually get a word in yet, but it's interesting, right? That I didn't use the word cynical. I didn't say cynical business. I just said business driven. And it's interesting that you would attach an emotion to that. You would attach cynical to that. I didn't say that. I think it's just interesting because a business driven thing, that doesn't have to be heartless, right? I'm just saying, in the world of console, it tends to be driven by the heart of people who go, this is going to be fantastic, this is going to be amazing, this is what we should do. Whereas in mobile, the business-driven bit is where you're looking at your 3 Vs, you're looking at your vision, you're looking at your values, and you're looking at validating what you're doing. And you don't have that level of analytical, logical review that you do in mobile. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, I guess so. Although I can tell you from my personal experience that games companies, even on console and PC, even smaller studios now, are moving that way. They don't just greenlight game ideas now based on the whole "if you build it, they will come" Field of Dreams philosophy anymore. It is now much more about getting market data in place.
Because that's madness.
Yeah, exactly right. It is madness. Why spend $10 to $20 million proving if you're insane or not? You can spend a couple of $100,000 on a prototype, get out there and test it, and see if it actually has any legs before you actually start spending the real big bucks.
Exactly. I mean, that's very much, the mantra that we use at my startup, actually. I mean, yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, interject there, Liam, and say that I think that is maybe a bit unfair to say that. I mean, I would certainly say that even now on console and sort of PC live service, the same thing has happened. I mean, I would say the most successful game in the world right now is Fortnite. And Fortnite was released as a kind of unfinished product to begin with multiple game modes, and using product management, the game actually was not working. Then they said that there was this game called PUBG that was doing quite well. And someone obviously had the bright idea of, well, rather than cut our game that we spent 10 years in development on, why don't we put a battle royale mode in? There's a kind of last throw of the dice and see if there's anything in there. and they executed on that. And now we're making over $3.5 billion a year, and it's the biggest game in the world by some contention. Likewise, you have things like Call of Duty Warzone was released kind of like quite quickly without like all the bells and whistles and polish on it, because they understood that a virus was coming to the world for longer and have more time to play. And again, it's been very successful. So I think more and more these sort of practices are kind of coming in. And I think, I guess what it's good we have in this podcast today, I think what you're going to find more and more, it'll be standard practice on sort of any title, regardless of where it's been developed, is you're going to have these various roles within any team because you're going to need it. Otherwise, you just run too much of a risk. And these days, given the massive cost of development, look at PlayStation 5 titles and things like that, how much they're going to cost to make a sort of AAA, quadruple A, or is it quintuple A now that we're on to the fifth generation? The costs are going to be so big that, you can't afford to get it wrong. Otherwise, that could be the end of a studio. So you're going to have these kind of practices in place. Yeah. But that could be like, I guess, a setup for where we're going. And then, there's definitely got to be balance found between it all. And I think it's good because the podcast, we might be able to explain, what the expectations should be from each person, how everyone can work together. This is important that, you operate as a team and not as a kind of Wolverine solo artist going mad, causing chaos in any sort of game production setup.
When we talked last time, Liam, one of the things we touched on was the whole difference between mobile and console and PC, where on console and PC, you're basically convincing users up front to pay some money. And then you don't really care if they stick around for a long time after that. Whereas mobile, it's the inverse in terms of business model. You're giving it away for free and trying to justify whether or not players can open their wallets and their hearts and give you some cash and some time. And I read a really interesting article actually a couple of days ago talking about the cost of, to your point, Anil, the cost of next gen development for PlayStation 5 and the new Xbox coming out. And they're talking about, to make those games justifiable for the really high-end AAA examples, the Call of Duties and so on, they might need to start looking at increasing the retail price point to things closer to the $100 mark. And I think that article really, ahead of this call, just put it in context for me of what great value for money free-to-play mobile really is. I mean, yes, it's free, but also the quality of the games, considering you're paying nothing for them, is actually really, really good. Even bad games on the stores, like, kind of one-man show, YOLO guys who are making their own stuff. Like, I'm playing those sometimes and going, you know what, this is actually not bad, considering like one person made this and not teams of multiple hundreds. Is it hundreds of times worse than a Call of Duty? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I think that's, well, like I said, I think there's still this sort of unfair mantra put on mobile games to say that's how it's done. I mean, mobile games, by the way, make more money out of any of the gaming slices of the pie. They make more money than console games. They make more money than PC games. It's the biggest revenue generator in the industry. So I think to kind of badmouth it is being stupid, if I'm being honest. Wait till League of Legends comes out on mobile in China this year. You'll see what a real kind of successful game looks like.
It's a money printing license, man. That's going to make so much cash.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, let's maybe move it on. I think maybe then, you can start, Liam, but like a good place maybe is to define like what the two kind of positions are, because I think something that I've personally found with sort of any studio is even what a producer does or what a product manager does can vary so wildly from different things. And in fact, I can tell you that like I've had the role title of, being a producer myself, but actually doing product management, and also have had the role product manager and I felt being a producer. So, it depends on what you kind of mean by those terms.
Yeah. So you asked me to define them. I can have a swift go.
I can, but I think that could be, go on then.
So, but I think that your point is most valid of all, that there is an ambiguity, and the ambiguity tends to be on the production side, in that a producer, as me and Callum were talking about in the first podcast, the title itself is an umbrella term which means many different things to many different people, but tends to have an emphasis around some elements of project management, some elements of leadership and care for teams, some element of stakeholder management, et cetera, in which a producer is supposed to be a person who can sit around a game and make sure it's going in the right direction, probably has creative elements of influence to a degree, depending on where they're working. But a producer is necessarily ambiguous, because the job is necessarily ambiguous, because if you're working on a game as a producer, you know that really, if anything's blowing up anywhere or anything's going wrong anywhere, you're going to have to step in. You're going to have to try and make things more efficient, more effective, and optimize, et cetera, all over the place with workflows and pipelines. And a lot of your time is spent talking to people and making things happen and unblocking and all that sort of stuff. And I think, as we talked about before, it's, as a producer, as you become more senior, you go away from that kind of associate producer, almost scrum master type role, to somebody who is much more of a leader, a seasoned leader. Whereas product ownership and product management come from a particular methodology of software development, where there are books written about what that role means, what those roles mean. And you can have a product manager in charge of a bunch of product owners, but basically you're supposed to have a vision holder, and you're supposed to have ways of measuring the value that you're bringing. And you have a responsibility to, as a product owner, to deliver a product as quickly as possible in some form that people want and that the customer wants, and that you can have your metrics, etc., and measure what it is that you're bringing, and you can see how successful you are, and you can swivel on data-driven decision making. But it's within a particular methodology, and I think that's what's really interesting, is that a producer comes from a kind of a free hybrid reign of whatever you need to do, whereas a product owner comes from an element of it's not an element, but it comes from some really tight definitions around what you should really do to do the best job at what you're doing. Now, I think in the games industry that a product owner can come in as a product owner or as a product manager, which are kind of interchangeable depending upon your definition, and not really realize that, and actually be tending towards production type work. But I think, in my experience, that a product owner tends to have a far greater grasp of the vision, the creative input, telling people what to do, and just driving the production, if you will, of a game, say in mobile, than a producer tends to have. Just in my experience, which is far more limited than yours in that.
That is quite interesting, because I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I think it's like, I think the one issue we're going to run into in this podcast is a lot of things are going to end up being sort of like, how long is a piece of string? There isn't going to be like a definite answer that you can say, yes, this is exactly what each person should do in every setup, and that's how it works, and just stick to that, and everyone's going to be all right. It's going to be cushy, because it's not like that at all. And I think something that I'm guessing is the reason why Callum brought it up is that you tend to find in many studios that you get the product owner and the lead producer, executive producer, we want to call it, kind of stepping on one another's toes, and you get like conflict. And essentially that conflict comes down to who's really in charge, if I'm being like totally honest. And in an ideal setup, what you've got to do is you've got to have, roles and responsibilities, areas. I think ultimately you've got to choose one person to be the key person who makes the ultimate decision if need be, but who's got to respect the other person's opinion. And it can be either or in those roles. Because there's a lot of kind of like similarities between the two, and you have to kind of make that call as to who really calls the shots. I mean, the way that I would typically see it is, I think that by its definition, the product owner is going to be the person responsible for like the business outcome of the project or game that you're working on. So if your game fails, that person is going to be carrying the can. They're probably going to lose their job or move somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. So that person is probably going to be under the most pressure to sort of perform. But ultimately, that's also why they make the decisions, because that's kind of like the trade-off in that respect. Then the person who's kind of in charge of production is sort of the person who's going to be in charge of making sure that all those decisions or vision of the game or whatever, it can actually be done. And organized in such a way that the resources of the team are best used to sort of make it happen. Now, that doesn't mean that person doesn't get any say in a decision. They could be making loads of decisions. They should be having like an equal stake at the table sort of thing. But, ultimately it's like, any company, any organization, there's going to have to be someone at the end of the day who does like that ultimate call, and then it kind of gets executed around the team. And I think then when you're going to get, where you often get conflict is then if there's disagreements between the two, which one gets followed and so on and so forth. And that becomes difficult, especially as you often get the fact that then product people, a lot of the people that are coming into the industry now aren't really that game savvy. In fact, quite often they're clueless.
Yeah.
And they might have that kind of like, let's say, I mean, it can be sort of good and bad. So like, I'll give you an example that I used to work for a Japanese company called Gree, which was like a super interesting company. I really enjoyed my time there. And they had the kind of experience where when they first started up, they would get kind of typical people who had like years of games industry experience working on console titles or AAA titles that all had proven something, you know, worked on a title that made, you know, like a hit title essentially, right? And put them in charge of games, and they just sort of completely and utterly failed. And then they took on people that essentially were kind of like graduates from Harvard, right, who had no games experience, and put them on the same titles. And the interesting thing was that the titles, in my opinion, were significantly worse in terms of being a joyous product or something that you'd want to play. But guess which of the two types ended up making serious amounts of, you know, change, right? And it was actually the secondary type, right? Which is really sad and depressing. But the point there is that what was happening there, and you want to kind of get an ideal sort of blend between the two, is that sometimes it is important to have someone who can kind of like look through the bullshit and just look at like the facts of the data and use that to interpret where you're going. I mean, I can tell you from an example that's very relevant to me right now is that we've just started testing a game that we worked on. And it's super interesting how some of the things that we had quite long debates on are now like totally irrelevant because it's like, well, you know, people aren't even getting to that section. So it doesn't really matter that we spend sort of like weeks or months deciding what should go here. We've got to fight this other fire somewhere else and kind of see where it is. And sometimes that's quite refreshing because then that kind of can focus the team, because rather than having this sort of imaginary conversation about how you think it's going to be perceived, you've got like real data to validate that it's working or not. It's kind of like, you know, you could be going to the gym and, you know, I'm running like an hour every day, but not losing any weight. You know, well, because you've got that validation that you're not losing any weight, you must be doing something wrong, and you can sort of try and fix it. So that's why, you know, you get this kind of friction, like I say, then, because when you get these type of people involved, if they've got sort of no experience making games whatsoever, they'll often be making decisions that can really piss off the rest of the team. Now, that's not a good thing to have either, because then you're also going to get kind of subpar products, and you'll end up with, you know, these things that are kind of lucrative, but will never sort of really hit like the top of the pile. And I would say like the games over the sort of last 5 to 10 years that have been like, you know, become the phenomenons, they have the right balance between having kind of savvy product management there, but they've also clearly very good games or have like a soul and a heart to it. And I think like Clash of Clans by Supercell is a great example of that. Like you can see over the years, they've added sensible things to the game that have like massively moved the KPIs. So they've added things like kind of like clan versus clan wars and things like that. That was like a huge update that really shifted the numbers. But when you play the game is like a joy and a delight to play, and it doesn't feel that you're sort of just going through this well executed spreadsheet that's, you know, designed to hook money from you sort of every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's like a very I think that's like a big nuance of the setup in companies.
Yeah, there's an interesting point in amongst all that as well, where you talk about kind of the difference between the Harvard business guy coming in and running a product and the traditional game team, right? And this is where I think some of the producer versus product manager tension comes in, is that the producer has the typical has the sort of the stereotypical role of like time, quality, and budget being the things that they care about, and quality traditionally would have kind of fallen on game producers and game designers to say, is the game good enough, or reviewers when it gets to that stage. However, when you have a product manager or you have data-driven game development and you can actually use KPIs to say, is the game quality, you'd think that having data would kind of be a non-discussable kind of black and white decision, like data tells you, is it good or is it bad? But actually, as Anil's kind of pointing out, there are some games where KPI-wise, version A of a game might outperform version B, but it just doesn't feel as good to you as a player, feel as good to you as a proper gamer. It's designed to elicit a certain reaction from players that favor the KPIs rather than necessarily being a better game as a gamer would consider it. And I think that's where some of the negativity around mobile as a platform sort of creeps in, where people look at it as a business product rather than a work of passion. Back to your earlier point, Liam.
Just from people I know who work in, say, mobile as on development, I think they would find it very difficult to move over from software development on mobile, if we can call it that, to, say, traditional PC console. I do think there's a different feel to the way you work, and I wonder what you two think. If you were to describe a day in the life of a say, a producer and product owner on a mobile game? How's that going to look? How are they going to be different from each other?
I mean, I've just made the switch back when I was working for my previous employer to doing PC and console stuff again. And I can tell you, having come from mobile and moving back to it, that there's a profound difference for a producer in that when you work in mobile space or any kind of games or software as a service space and you have that data available to you, it's a really useful extra set of tools for you as a producer to be able to ask yourself, are we making the right choices? Are we doing the right things? Are we adding more risk to the success of the project at the end of this? I did find that I spent probably more time discussing the KPIs and what they actually mean with people, because PC and console aren't as familiar with that as mobile is, and why a certain KPI should look a certain way, why it doesn't matter if it's below a certain number and so on, and trying to educate PC and console makers around what KPIs are and why we use them. Because they've kind of heard the terms, right? They've read a bunch of Gamma Sutra articles. They kind of understand what KPIs are and why they should have them, but they don't really understand the applicability of them, like why a certain KPI is applicable to a certain game genre more than another, or why a certain KPI on mobile perhaps might, day one retention on mobile, 50%. Cool, great, pick that as an arbitrary number. Is that a thing you should aim for on PC and console? Who knows? They didn't know themselves. There was a lot of education in that process. And that's where I think that the PC and console space is right now. It understands the value of this and it's trying to figure out how to plug that value into its established ways of working without sacrificing the soul of the game, right? The game design and the game production team kind of owning the vision for that.
Anil, what would you answer?
Well, do you want me to answer the question of like, what does a day in the life look like? Because I think that's like a good way of looking at it, especially between two. I mean, I have to say, just going back to the topic of like people going from working in a sort of like fast-paced, sort of data-driven environment to working on console. I do know people who've done it, and yes, they struggled very badly, and sort of came back running to what they were used to. But equally, I've seen it the other way as well, where I used to work at Natural Motion, and that's sort of a company that, because they have high fidelity 3D graphics, often would take people on who'd worked for, games like, Sony's, your Microsoft's, high end games, and come to mobile, and you could tell they're just like, I do not like this at all. And I could totally understand it, because, they're probably like, who's let these crazy people loose that are making all the decisions? Those crazy people being the product managers, and kind of vice versa. So I think, it depends on what kind of stage your game is in development at, because, once you've got a game that's kind of out, what tends to happen, so for example, what we're doing right now in my company, is that then me as the product person, I'll be looking at the data, and we do it on a kind of every sort of 2-week basis, and say, okay, so these are the numbers, and what are those numbers? I mean, that's sort of like something that we might gloss over here, because, that's something that has to be understood by everyone. As Callum's point is that if you don't understand what this is, it can seem very sort of like loose and arbitrary, and what is it people are even chasing. But what you're trying to validate is, is your game, does it have the potential to be a scalable business? And what does a scalable business means? It means that essentially you are going to have to get people to play your game. To do that, you're going to have to market your game in some way. Or perhaps you're really lucky and you don't, because you've got a huge IP, but 99.9% of the time you will have to market it in some way, which is going to cost money. So if we're going to spend as a company, let's say £1 million to advertise our game to bring people in, are we going to make any return on that investment? Or are we actually just going to lose all that money? Because if we lose that money, well, there's no difference to me taking that £1 million, putting it in the toilet and flushing the chain, right? So using these numbers, we can see how many people are coming into the game, how many people stick around, how many of those people are spending money. And then based off that, you can kind of calculate, okay, so this is what on average people are going to be spending during their lifetime of the game. And so, if that number is, for example, on average $2.50, if then on average we're spending $2 to bring someone in, well, 2.5 is more than 2. That's how numbers work, not just a pretty face here, Liam. And that would be considered a successful product. And you could start marketing the game, and maybe you can even spend more than $1 million, because, you could get even more people in. Of course, it's not sort of infinite, marketing gets, kind of exponentially more expensive and things like that. And that's what you're sort of looking to do. So once you've got that, what will happen is someone like myself will say, okay, here's the latest build that we made. In this build, here were the things that we changed or added. here's what's happening. So perhaps we added like a new game mode. This is how many people played that game mode. Here's how many people have played it more than once. Here's how far they're getting. Here's where they're dying in this game mode. Here's what they're doing, yada, yada, yada. And so, for example, you could try something and you could see, okay, so this kind of like paintball-esque battle royale mode that we added into the game, just, putting it on my backside here, like Splatoon or something. Oh, it turns out it's like really, really popular. People are actually playing this game mode more than they played the main game mode. Maybe we should focus it on that. And for example, that would have happened on Fortnite. Their original game was actually about this kind of asynchronous base building aspect that you had to do. I mean, it's hilarious to me how many people have played that game and have never actually played the main mode, what was supposed to be that game, right? They had that mode, no one really played it. Then they tried a battle royale mode and they've been like, wow. So people on average tend to play the Fort mode twice and then they don't play it again. They tend to play the battle royale mode 20 times a day, 5 days a week, and they're playing for 2.5 hours. Well, that's incredible. That means you've got a hit right there. So me as the product person would say, well, hey team, I've got this data here and it suggests that the battle royale mode is really popular. So I think that we should do more development on the battle royale mode. What do you think? And then hopefully the rest of the team will be like, oh yes, those insights are quite true. Maybe we should shelf this 6-month roadmap that we've got for the Fort mode and reimagine to see what we could do with the battle royale mode. So that's the kind of thing that you're typically looking at. And I've done it in a kind of nuanced way there, but that's sort of what's going on. Now, that's all well and good though, once you've got your game live. So I think like an interesting thing is, well, what do you do before your game is going live? And, that is, I think we get like a lot of debates. And like sometimes you could even argue that, maybe you don't need a product person in charge at that point in time. The problem is that if you do that, then you're just asking for trouble when that product person comes in, because then they're going to be doing things that are like directly conflicting with the original vision of the game and, knock some jaws out of place. And I don't think that's a healthy approach. I think you don't need to have like a huge product management team on the game when it starts, but you've definitely got to have 1, maybe 2 people there to also be that kind of thing. The difference there is then you are going to be having far looser conversations, because at that point in time, there's no way to validate things. So, I've just seen while we're talking now, Liam's got a Horizon poster in the background there, right? So Horizon 2 is coming out. So if that was going to be like a live service game, in the 2 years that you're developing it, the product person hasn't really got a leg to stand on. They could say, I think that we should add, this dinosaur versus dinosaur battle mode, which is like a fighting game. And sure, that could work, but it also couldn't work. If the game was live, you could make like a kind of very vertical slice version of it, knock it out in 3 to 4 months, see if people enjoy it, and then say, oh, okay, people like it, let's keep going with it. But it's kind of like, the high-end console development world, that just doesn't happen. So in cases like that, that is like a lot trickier. But still, I think what the best practice then is that, again, the team in general, not just the 2 people at the top, but, the whole team work together to sort of set some goals for what they're trying to achieve. What is best to do is also try and say some sort of flags in the sand so that when your game is live, you can do some validation to see if like this new feature that people have put into the game, is it going to be popular or not? So, what tends to happen when you get sequels is that someone will try to do something innovative in it. Is that innovation going to work or not? You can, see, are people engaging with it or not? If they are, you keep it. If not, they don't. So, let's say you have like a fighting game, and like the big thing for the fighting game is it used to be 1-on-1, but now you're going to have a 2-on-2 mode. So you're going to make the assumption that people are going to enjoy that. But then when it comes out, you could look to see if that's the case or not. And, if they really have enjoyed it, that could determine the direction of like the next one in the franchise or what you kind of develop with it. If it doesn't, well, you might go back to the 1 versus 1 mode, because that's kind of proven. So these are sort of very loose theoretical examples, but that's sort of what happens. But yeah, this is definitely, I think, the kind of crux of it is like I say, teams are very different. So I know that, for example, Zynga now have moved more to a model of where when they have a game in development, they won't have a product person involved on it because the game's not live, and it will be very kind of design driven and EP driven. But then once the game is kind of ready to go into soft launch, they'll bring that person on. And I would be quite interested to know when that happens, what kind of conflict it is, because Zynga, a lot of their titles that they develop internally, I actually don't know the last title that they developed internally that's been successful. They've actually ended up buying titles. Like they bought Natural Motion, they bought Small Giant Games, they bought Gram Games, they just bought Peak Games. So, I'm not sure their approach is working, but I don't want to kind of like say yes or no, because that company's still done very successful and they're building up their portfolio quite well. But that's sort of like what an average day would look like, I think, in terms of two. So, okay, to just give you the other sense of what would the producer be doing? The producer would be, based on then what the data's saying, trying to formulate the plan or take things from the backlog that are going to be applicable to that. So if, let's say, from the product response is like, okay, so our vision was that we thought this multiplayer mode was going to be really successful, but it turns out that only 10% of people play it and they're not really engaging with it. Then if the team decides, okay, but they still want to really push on that because that's the thing they believe is going to be successful, okay, we're going to deprioritize all these kind of single player, improvements, like a better campaign mode, more customization, and we're just going to focus on making multiplayer things work because that's where we need to go. So and then they would move those kind of things off and then, put that into the sprint or your cycle, however you work. And then you try and finish those up. Then you put that version out live and you see if those changes have made a difference. So that's sort of like what a day stroke working cycle looks like in a kind of typical product stroke producer setup.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it as like the typical agile setup, right, where you're doing stuff in your sprints, but outside that sprint you have a backlog that exists, and a product team is always prioritizing and grooming that backlog. Then the product manager is a key part of that grooming process, right, helping to try and identify which bits are from that backlog get prioritized higher, which bits get prioritized lower, and therefore which bits have the most impact, because you should always work on the most impactful pieces on a product backlog in an agile sense. Which bits have the most impact to the overall success or likelihood of success for the product. I don't know about you, Anil, but one of the things I tend to find as well with the sort of the producer and product manager roles and the overlap between them is there's a third element in that as well for an interesting menage a trois, which is the design role.
Of course.
Where, you get these kind of frosty situations sometimes where, the producer has an opinion, the product manager has an opinion, the lead designer has an opinion. All three could be equally valid. All three come from different places and different experiences. And then, trying to be the referee in that situation is often what I've ended up doing a lot as a producer or as an EP, trying to like square the circle and make sure that they can come to some sort of a common agreement that gets the overall product to a better place, not necessarily one person's opinion being stronger than another.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And sometimes you even have more than that. You might have the creative director or art director also chiming in there as well with, oh, why does it look so terrible? We should be focusing on this. And then the product person will be like, oh, but the numbers aren't doing this. The design person will be like, oh, but it's not in the spirit of the game design. And it can all be a kind of free for all. So that's why I think it's very important to sort of culturally set up in any team, who's going to be having whichever roles and responsibilities, what you're trying to achieve together, and then working towards that as a goal. Because at the same time, what you don't want to do, and this is a problem I do see in some of these sort of studios, is you do end up marginalizing some of those people because they're not allowed to make a decision. And that's even worse, because then that's how you end up with these kind of soulless things. What you need to do in an ideal world is that like your game designer, your art director feels that they can execute to the best of their abilities, but understanding that there is some kind of framework that you've got to operate in.
Totally agree, man.
And the way that I would describe it as kind of like, well, look at like the 16-bit era of games, right? You might want to do the most lovely looking game you've ever thought of, but literally the hardware can only support things up to a certain thing. And your tech lead will be like, well, look, I literally cannot have sprites bigger than this size because the game won't render them. Then the great art team is going to make beautiful looking graphics, but working within that budget. And I think that sometimes perhaps that is the role even of the product person, but to an extent the producer as well, to sort of get that kind of thing out of it. But it can be like a high stress situation when you see different people all having their own important part at the table in terms of being a key stakeholder, but what you're trying to achieve together.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that we as an industry tend to overlook as part of the pre-production phase. We typically look at pre-production as the place where you sort of prove out your technical risks and maybe do some research. But for me, actually, as much as anything, it's about building that team and having that team come together and understanding how they work together, who sort of owns which parts of the project, and when you have to collaboratively come together to make a collective decision. If you look at some of the sort of team compositions, right, typically you'll have a producer, a product manager, an art director, a lead engineer, a lead designer, etc., who could all take a game in a very different direction if they were given total autonomous creative control over things. And that pre-production phase for me is typically about trying to bring those collective leads in individual areas together to figure out how they collectively maintain the product vision. And the product vision ultimately is a thing where, in sort of old school sense for you and I, Liam, producers have always been told, you own the product vision, you own the product vision. And I think that through the course of my career, I think it works better if there is one person who is ultimately not necessarily the vision owner, but kind of the vision measurer, I guess. They're the person who looks at the things that are being proposed by the team and says, does this hold true to the product vision, yes or no? And I think it's my experience, I guess, that product managers are the ones who are more willing to experiment with the vision, I guess, because the vision may not always be proven to deliver the best business result for the product. And I think that's where some of this tension comes in. As well as one thing that, while we've been talking, actually struck me, which is that I think for product manager and producer, both of those are quite traditionally used to being, by default, the product owner on a project.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is where inherently some of the tension comes from, right? You've got a producer who's being told delivering the game on time to quality, which will mean making it profitable, right? Regardless of what people think, that's basically what you measure quality as, and on budget, again, about the quality and the financials. And then you've got a product manager whose job is to kind of make sure it's the most successful product it can be. Well, it can't be successful if it's going to be late because it costs money. It can't be successful if it's gone over budget because your ROI is going to be worse. So you've got these two roles with very similar overlap in terms of the objective, measurable delivery of the game, with slightly different ways of sort of getting to that end result, which I think is why it puts them in that direct conflict from day one. Both of them are traditionally set up to be the owner of a product, not necessarily collaborators on a product.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that is exactly it, because that's how you would be measured in success in typical, for an EP on a big console title. That is exactly what you're after, isn't it? You've also probably got like a Metacritic rating that you've got to hit. You've given X amount of money, X amount of resources. And if you're like one of the top, producers in the industry, Liam Wickham just released, the Liam Wickham Saga. It was a top game. It won the Golden Joystick. Right, yeah. It was done on time. Exactly. Sold 25 million copies. Yeah. Exactly, it's going to be a PlayStation 6 exclusive. Boom!
You heard it here first. Heard it here first.
Exactly. Whereas
Old Head Studios that I'm launching.
If it's commercially, it's late. If it's commercially a failure, if it didn't hit a Metacritic rating, you'd probably have to pack your bags and go work somewhere else. That's typically how it's done. So that, I think like I say, that's the kind of sort of thing that has to be sorted. Is where are those kind of like roles and responsibilities between everyone on the team? Because otherwise, if they're not, if each person doesn't understand what is expected of them, it does cause conflict, and that conflict normally then makes its way down to the rest of the team and causes chaos.
One thing I would advise all your listeners to this podcast, Liam, which is that as we know, producers are responsible for managing the risk of the delivery and the success of their projects. I would encourage all producers to think of a product manager as a way of lowering the risk of their product. Ultimately, any product manager who's worth their salt will deliver you a better product, a better game performance in terms of user behavior, user satisfaction, than if you went in there blind. And I think this is why we're now gradually seeing even PC and console moving to a state where they're starting to bring product managers into their development cycles and their development methodologies, if not necessarily to the same extent as, say, a mobile environment would, but they are starting to make their way in there now. People do appreciate that this different skill set, this data-driven, analytical, business-minded methodology is, honestly, it's a really smart and sensible way of de-risking your product as early as possible. We can't just go in there blind anymore like we used to in the good old days of console development.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to give a really good example of this. You guys played the game Sleeping Dogs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's quite an old game. It was, I believe, published by Square Enix. But what happened with that title is that they initially released the game and they got kind of middling reviews in terms of user reviews of like 63%. And then someone had the bright idea to put some analytics into the game and see what was going on. And what they found that 10% of the people that bought the game never got past the first chapter because of a perceived difficulty thing. Well, they knew it was a problem because people just didn't beat this boss. So then what they did is they made like a kind of update through a patch. They tweaked the difficulty of that boss. And then their Metacritic review went up from 63% to 83%. And that is just like a fabulous example how even in a console game, something that probably no one would have thought about at all during development had a massive impact, because then that game starts to become more successful. It's spread by being word of mouth. People are like, oh, we played this game, it's really good. And it ended up doing like a lot better. So I think that's an example of how that sort of thing has already crept its way into console development. And if it isn't, it should be used a lot more, because yeah, I think like another good example is, look at No Man's Sky when that first came out. Now, for different reasons, that was like hated on by the community for sort of under-delivering and over-promising. We also call that the Peter Molyneux effect here in the UK. If anyone's ever worked at a company he's been at. But then to give them credit, what they did is they persevered with it and they improved it. Now, to be fair, I think they didn't use any, I'm not sure if they used any metrics to do that or not. They probably didn't. But yeah, I think that these days games tend to be a marathon, not a sprint. They tend to go on for a while, as you say, DLC life cycles and things like this. So that's why the top companies are bringing in these people, because they realize it's a huge part of it, and more is going that way. And my personal opinion is, I have to say, so I worked on a mobile title that did really successfully in the early days. It was sort of like one of the top grossing titles in the USA on the iPhone, and it was a free-to-play title. And it's funny because my experience of having worked on that is that when we first started, I was like, are we mad? There is no way people are going to buy these virtual Smurf berries, you can probably guess what the game is, to, speed up their progress in the game. This is going to kill our team. It ended up making like £1 million a day. And I was like, okay, well, here's where I can acknowledge that I might have been drinking the Kool-Aid and I didn't actually know what I was talking about. And it's time to learn right now what is happening here, because clearly this is the future. And I thought even back then, it is inevitable that the top games in the world would end up being AAA versions of free-to-play games. And that is what has happened with League of Legends, with Fortnite, with insert game here, because once you've got the ability to iterate on your data and improve things all the time, it just takes so much risk out of it. And you can measure things, and it just gives you such a competitive advantage. So more and more games are going to be going that way, because it's just a smarter way of doing it. And it's like, when you're talking about the sums that are involved in developing games, you can't afford to take those risks. I think you see it in many industries. It's why now, even in movies, I personally feel like a lot of movies these days are kind of quite soulless and hollow, but at the same time, they tend to be absolute juggernauts. I look at the Marvel films, because they have like a well understood package. They sort of know to do audience tests on it very early on. You get a lot of examples where they've actually sometimes completely changed the director and or cast sort of 3 or 4 months in, because they know it's not going to work out. I believe that happened on Star Wars, and they had to reshoot vast chunks of it and ended up making it successful. So people are understanding that, although it takes a lot of the kind of soul and passion and the artistry away from like an industry and medium that we absolutely love, that at the end of the day, the results speak for themselves.
And let's be honest, right? Console and PC have been aware of the fact they need to get user input much, much earlier. That's why we run closed betas. It's why we run friends and family tests. It's why we do all these kind of early access programs and so on, right? We do know that the game needs to have some element of user input in there. But I think the product role really takes that to a new zenith, right? It's much more analytical. It's much more focused. It's much less ambiguous than the way PC and console have traditionally done it. Anil, in your experience, having done the product role for a number of years now, right? What do you think of product managers as designers? Because I personally find that when I'm trying to manage teams that have got designers and producers and product managers in there, it can be very, very harmonious and work really well, up until the point where a product manager tries to design a feature. Now, of course, there will be exceptions to this rule where some product managers are great at design, but they tend to design for an end result in terms of a KPI rather than design for an end result in terms of player satisfaction, in my opinion. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, I just laughed there because the amount of times that I've had this particular conflict or argument is crazy. It's like almost everyone that I've been at. And yeah, that's, I think, even more than producer versus product manager. That tends to be the biggest sort of conflict you see in the team, which is product manager versus design. And often it comes because, again, each one of the two roles doesn't really understand what the other one's supposed to do or how they can work together. Going back to that example I gave a bit earlier on about how this company Gree took on people that had games industry experience versus the people that just use data, that really shows you the kind of two ends of the spectrum. And, ideally what you want to do is create some resolution where each party understands the other. So I feel the product manager should not be designing a feature, but at the same time, I have done it myself plenty of times. In fact, I've been a game designer, but if you set it out, what you want to do instead is like give like a framework to saying like, this is the problem that we want to achieve. So a common one you'll see on many games is that, okay, in the tutorial, not enough people are getting through that we would like to make the game successful. So how can we make it either more accessible, or it might not be more accessible, maybe it's just boring and it's a bit plain. How do we make it exciting, but getting the right balance between excitement and not confusing people so they kind of get through? And then the designer can go away and kind of look at that. But I think with that one particular, like I say, I think what has to happen, not just with like design and product management, but production and everything, is that we need like better osmosis, that everyone on the team understands what each other person's role in the team is as well. So I think where this will typically kind of fall down is if you have like a designer that's like very heart and soul and doesn't want anyone interfering with it, and they have like a clear vision and it's sort of like very, driven, passionate, direct. And don't get me wrong, there's like definite examples in the past, especially of people being really like that and being successful. But now that we've got this kind of way of validating if that said decision is correct or not, they have to work within those parameters. So I think these days what I'd encourage is, I think that the better designers realize that when they design a system or a feature or anything in a game, they are also putting into like the design specs, and here are some criteria that we can actually use to validate or measure how successful this thing has been. And based on that, going forwards, they might even look at that themselves and understand what they're doing. So, I think, for example, there's different designers, right? But if you were doing like the systems design of a game and like the game economy, like how much should a player be earning every time they play? How much should they get when they defeat somebody else? You can look at that end product and say, oh, okay, well, actually, this means that people are progressing through the game too slowly, so they're not doing very well. We need to speed it up. They should have some kind of understanding of the levers that can be pulled and operated when to do it. But yeah, I've had that conflict many times myself, and it doesn't normally go well. And again, it just comes down to like who's in charge of the game, and it has to be decided. I think, there's got to be respect from both ends. Like, yes, I feel like if the product manager is writing like detailed specs, that's going to really feel like stepping on the toes of the design team. But then equally, it depends what's coming back from the design team, because if the design team are just designing things that don't ever solve the problem, or they don't seem to understand it, then I could understand why the product person has written the spec in the first place. So I kind of feel sometimes that rather than having these divisions, people on the team should just try and be the same sort of thing. Like I've often sometimes said, like, why is there a designer and a product manager? Why can't they both be the same thing? And I kind of feel like that is possible, but in reality, it will kind of never happen.
Yeah.
But I do think that what we kind of got to in an industry is that, like, for good or for bad, I'd actually say it's more bad than good, is that people are given these specific roles that they have to fill, and you can only do those things that are within that role. And if you do something that isn't within that role, that's considered bad. But that is not how it should be, because the world is evolving, the world is changing all the time, games are changing, you're all working together as a team. So sometimes you're going to have to adapt or do things that are a little bit outside of it, and that is difficult to get right, because if you're working in like a massive team, you've got 250 people working on it, you would not be able to do that. It would be madness. There, everyone has got to have a very well respected role. Even if all your job is to be the lead tree developer and you're making trees for the game, well, that is important. If you're making an open world game, you probably don't want your tree developer coming in and writing specs in terms of how to improve KPIs. But, smaller teams, it can be better to have that kind of understanding. So it's, again, like I was saying earlier, it's a bit of a tricky question. How long is a piece of string? But you see that conflict all the time, for sure.
I think there's also this situation as well in our industry where, because product management is quite a new role, they don't have that depth of experience in terms of how to make a game. And that creates an odd us and them feeling with game teams sometimes, where product managers kind of come in and they're almost, in the same way that producers are sometimes, they're almost the bad guy on the team, because they're holding the team accountable. And when the game isn't good enough, and they can actually measure this with data, they can say, well, the game isn't good enough. They get to be the person who delivers the bad news. And that's then coupled with, like I was saying, that sort of lack of experience of what it takes to make a game. And Anil, I'm sure you've seen this a bunch of times, right? Where product managers get very frustrated with the game teams when they're like, I've got an obvious solution that fixes the game. Implement it now. Have to implement it now. And their lack of understanding of how the game making process works often means that there's this frustration that kind of sits and festers with product people sometimes, where they're constantly like pointing fingers at the dev team, or they're frustrated with them that they aren't making the changes fast enough. They aren't making the KPIs improve fast enough. They're not implementing their features quickly enough. And that I think is a good example of where having having someone who sits above product managers or product or even producers sometimes, like an EP or a product owner role, I think clearly needs to be identified from the outset in any given project. And again, that's why I think pre-production is such a useful phase for this, where really establishing who owns which pieces and who owns the vision overall, I think is the key to success for any game that wants to operate now in a producer and product manager split.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I think you've nailed it. That is the sort of thing that is necessary. I mean, yeah, I do think talking specifically about product managers, I think that's something that I really encourage them to do. And I think the problem is it's so rare to find, which is that I would always encourage them to kind of understand the nuts and bolts of how a game works, right? Because here's the problem is that, like, you know, say if you get this classic example of the product manager writing a design spec, but I couldn't see that product manager, for example, going into some Lewis scripts and actually making things happen. Or, you know, even some of them I don't think would even go into a spreadsheet and be able to do the economy kind of thing. They'll only be looking at like a much higher level. And when you've got that, then people aren't really going to respect you. You're not really understanding what it is. And, you know, sometimes I encourage them to go deep in that, or like, you know, even give them some kind of experience for a couple of weeks. Okay, well, you go work with the design team and just make levels on this game and see what it's actually like. And then often, you know, I've done that in the past. They've come back and they're like, wow, okay, now I respect that a lot more, because whenever I tell them to do X, Y, and Z, you know, I don't understand that it's not as easy. It's like, oh, why is this level so difficult? And, you know, they're trying to get the balance between it, making it fun and challenging and, you know, also easy to play and things like that. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, though, because I think, again, the sort of product managers, because they're coming with like a normally kind of analytical background and things like that, it's I don't know, maybe the best way to sort of promote from within and try and build product managers out of existing people. I have to say, I think the best product managers I've seen have tended to come from
development,
other roles. Yeah, exactly. Also myself, I started off as a programmer, right? Why I ended up doing product management is that I can tell you this, actually what happened with the game is that we made an update and it went from making like 1 million a day to 1.6 million a day. And so obviously that's great news. We certainly went to the pub that Friday, but we were literally all looking around and I literally asked this question. I was going, so we've made this much extra money. Does anybody know why? And literally no one on the team could answer that question. They were just all looking around at one another. And, you know, it was like, why even bother answering? It's just happy days. And I was like, well, you know, it's like we found oil in the back garden, but how much is there? Is this like an infinite supply like Saudi Arabia, or is this going to run out and we've got to move to some other oil well as fast as possible? We need to understand what's going on here. And then what was really interesting is that then when we started digging in and looking at that, what was crazy is that we'd made this update, and this update, we had like a kind of 8-man team, and 6 of the 8 people were working on this huge feature that took like a month to get into this update. And so everyone, you know, you'd obviously imagine that was the reason why we made all the extra money. But what it actually transpired is that one of the people on the team at literally 3 o'clock on the final Friday before the build, which had to be done by 6 o'clock, had some spare time and started experimenting and put this other really tiny feature in where you could kind of like decorate your village, because it's the type of game that it was, and you could put like a pond there, and then you could put a boat into the pond, and the boat would kind of like bubble around with like the most basic physics, because he only had like an hour and a half to do it, right? And the thing is that this person and their change that they did made that money. And so this was pretty hilarious, because I remember going through the product deck that week and I was like, what do you think the reason is? And I kind of skipped to the next slide and I had like the most inappropriate picture of this person ever, you know, looking like an absolute bellend, because I got a picture of him in the pub. And I was like, Michael is the reason why we've made 600,000. I even had, here was the commit, here was the code change, you know, did it that way. But that was really interesting to kind of see it. And so, yeah, that's how, you know, that's the massive difference that things can make, and why teams need to kind of understand what they're doing in the game, how it makes a change, because otherwise, you know, you can be spending your focus, your time, effort and resources on the wrong thing. So that's just like a nice anecdote that is true, a very kind of funny story.
I hope Michael got the credit he deserves.
Yeah, I really feel he didn't, to be honest with you. I do know that he got a bonus, but I don't think he got 600,000. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't imagine maybe he got 1% of that number, I would have thought. But yeah, that's kind of unfortunate for him. But yeah, that's, you know, really shows you the power of it. So yeah, you're right. Basically, I feel that like that is something from all ends of the spectrum. Is that I think unfortunately what tends to happen is that people that then come into product management, because they tend to come from these kind of like big schools or universities that have, you know, high bar entry to get into, unfortunately they come in with a lot of arrogance and I'm better than you kind of thing, and you know, obviously that isn't going to go anywhere quickly. And again, that's why you kind of get this division and hatred, you know, which is the complete opposite of what you want. So I think it's important that, you know, they understand. And what will tend to happen is like an experienced one over the years is, even if they didn't know to begin with it, after you've worked in games for a couple of years, you're going to get an idea, you know, you'll see what happens. You get that feeling of, okay, I roughly think I know how long something like this would take to do. You wouldn't expect it to be done in, you know, 6 minutes kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Equally, if it's taking 6 months, you might be like, well, that sounds wrong. You know, my previous team, something like this was faster. So it can be kind of knowledge accumulated and picked up over time, but definitely causes conflict.
I think it's that air of superiority that you're talking about there, Liam, with Anil, with the guys coming in from all these business schools, which gives rise to my biggest pet peeve working with product managers, which is, I'm waiting to see Liam's facial reaction to this, buzzword bingo. Where you're in meetings with them and you'll just constantly hear all these kind of KPIs thrown around like it's common parlance, or they'll have like a wonderful kind of like business proverb they've picked up in business school that they'll throw in, and it just, you can see it driving the dev team slightly wild, right? Like they're just waiting to have a chance to just tell them to shut up because they just hate that kind of business speak around their passion projects. And I think that ultimately cuts to the heart of where there's this disconnect sometimes, because for a lot of people who get into it as an artist or a coder or a designer, you're doing it because it's your passion project. And these people who've gone to business school come into it and they're applying business sensibilities to things that we're very emotional about. Essentially, they're applying rationality to an emotional topic for a lot of people. And I think that really is at the heart of why there's this us and them divide sometimes between game teams and product management teams, and why the producer has such a hard job kind of straddling those two divides and trying to be that bridge and that effective conduit as the center point for everything, trying to keep those different perspectives moving in the same direction.
Yeah.
Can I ask a few questions?
Go for it.
Firstly, it's just so nice listening to you both talk. So interesting. So I'm sitting there pondering what you're saying, and I'm thinking, what would the world look like if you removed the producer? What would you lose or gain?
Do you want me to answer that as from a production perspective first? Because I've been in that situation before myself, and I think what you lose,
if you like.
I think what you lose is you lose the ability to tell if the game is going to be delivered in a sustainable way. Once you take the producer out of that equation, product managers can run teams. They can deliver implementation of features against a live product. However, I think they tend to do it in a less sustainable way than I think you do if you have a producer there. The producer acts as much more of a controlling force to make sure the game is built to last rather than built to achieve an instant gratification hit on the KPIs.
What's the role of the product manager when it comes to just to UA?
Well, they'll liaise with that person and they'll be able to understand how much can be spent on a title at any one given point in time to make to increase the revenue a bit. So let's give some real examples. Is that you might be working on a title, and this title you might be set then at board level has got a financial forecast to hit 25 million this quarter in terms of revenue. So then the product person goes back to their desk, they look at it and they're like, oh, well, based on current estimations, we're going to make 22 million. We need to make 3 million more as a team. And, they're given this challenge deliberately by the board because they're trying to increase their revenue and their stock value and et cetera, et cetera. So then that's the conversation between the team. So, one way of doing that is to bring in more players. That would be like an ideal way of doing it. But then, they'll speak to the UA person, and the UA person will be like, well, look, the thing is that we are only ROI positive after this amount of time, or if you want to get this many more players in, the KPIs have to be this much better. So yeah, this is, I think, I'm going to touch on your previous question as well, though. What would happen is if you remove the producer from it. And I agree with what Callum was saying. I think in generally speaking, you would lose the ability to actually deliver what you're trying to achieve. I think that's what the best producer is going to do. That said, I've seen teams that have existed that way. I've also seen teams that have existed the other way as well. So actually coming back to Supercell, which I'm a really big fan of, they typically don't have product managers on their team. They have like a game lead instead, but they have like a kind of central analytics team that will help them out and things like that. And then the game lead would make the decision. But I think really what we're talking about here is in teams like that, you tend to get this person that's like really good and they can kind of do both parts of the puzzle, if that makes sense. And that's kind of, I think, like should be a recurring theme that I'm kind of preaching throughout this. I kind of feel like no matter what role you do, rather than being something like, well, my job is I'm just going to make sure that the delivery of the game is done on time and you worry about that other shit, pardon my language, is like a bad way of doing it. And equally, like that a product person shouldn't be like, well, my role is to make sure that I give you the decisions and you make it happen. That's also a bad way of doing it. You should sort of be able to understand both. And, you know, like the clever way here then in this example of, okay, you need to make 3 million more over the case of a quarter. That's like an uplift of like 10 to 20%, is to look at, solicit ideas from the team, see what you think is going to be the thing, what is achievable in that amount of time. Also knowing that if it's going to be done over a quarter, when is that thing going to come out? Because if it doesn't come out in a quarter, guess what? Pretty sure you're not likely going to hit that target. So then when does it need to be out? How much time are you going to need to do it? You know, perhaps it is something that's going to be so sort of revolutionary that then liaising with the UA person, you can kind of almost relaunch the game and double down on it. Like you're so convinced that it's going to improve your metrics by X amount that you can afford to do that. But then if you're going to do that, that sounds very risky. How, you know, so then maybe you should soft launch this idea within your live title to a certain cohort of players, let's say 1% of them, to test your new feature to see if it works. What if the thing that you launch makes the game worse? That's happened to me a few times, sad to say, where you've actually put something in and it's actually made people spend less. That can happen because it's either annoyed people or ruined the balance of the game. So all these kind of different things have to be taken into account when doing it. And like I say, I think that's why it's important for everyone to understand each of the roles in case there. I think in this example that I've given, though, that's maybe where you see like get more of an understanding of what the product person's role is there, because that is typically what will happen, is that then in these kind of big, you know, sort of AAA free-to-play studios, be that console, PC, mobile, whatever, that's the sort of thing that they'll be done, is they will have these sort of goals given to them by upper business. You're talking like C-level staff, you know, VPs and things like that, that don't really work in game development but work in business, and they'll be expecting a certain amount of revenue to be coming in. So you've got to work with those things. And then you as the product owner in that case, your business responsibilities, you've got to be communicating and projecting out how much you're going to be making. You know, is it going to be on track? Is it not? Because sometimes as well, some of these companies is they're going to be making statements to Wall Street, right? They're going to be saying like, our guidance is that we think we're going to be hitting this kind of revenue. And guess what? If that company then doesn't hit its revenue guidance and it's considerably lower, it's not a good look. There was always like a talk actually at Zynga companies that if you got visited by the CEOs of 2 days before the end of the quarter, it meant your studio was getting cut. I'm being serious. So it's like, if you ever sort of heard that Don Matrick was coming to visit and you're like, hang on a minute, isn't the next board update in 2 days time? You might as well start clearing out your desk. Luckily, it didn't happen to me. But yeah, sadly, that did happen because, you know, they've got these, that is the big pressure that's involved there. And I think sometimes, despite the fact that like we have this kind of like talk about these guys being the bad guy, and I definitely can see why that has been thought, for some people I've worked with, I would definitely put in that camp, understand that that is the sort of, you know, risk and, you know, accountability that we're talking about there, and why it's like a very high pressure, and why that person might be, you know, upset, shall we say, if things aren't getting delivered on time.
Do you okay, let me ask some stupid questions so you can give some brilliant answers.
Go for it.
Let's say you're an indie. Let's say you're a couple of dozen people in, so quite a nice indie. And you think to yourself, do I need a product manager, really, a product owner? Let's say I'm making some games and I'm moving towards them becoming live services. Do I really need to consider that if I'm just an indie, or are they only a kind of a role for quite a big company with lots of people and really, you know, huge amounts of data and user acquisition budgets and all this sort of stuff?
It depends, I think, on what your goal is, right? As your indie team, are you making it as a lifestyle, or are you making it to make it big time? If I'm being honest, I think, what would you put a product manager on? You're doing it to improve the financials of your company stroke game. That's why you would do it. And, you know, it could ruin the kind of harmony that you've got into it. If, you know, you just like making games for the sake of making them, and don't get me wrong, you know, I actually do like doing that, even though I do something a bit different. You know, why rock the boat kind of thing. As it happened, you know, I'm in a startup. We only have that amount of people, a small number like that, but we do have a product person. But that's because, you know, we've got money off a venture capitalist. we've made the argument to them that if they invest in us, they can expect X amount of return on their interest, on their original investment within a certain amount of years. So that's why they're going to want these people in place. If that's your goal, yes, you're going to have to be organized quite differently. Listen, there's nothing wrong with just making games that you're passionate about and hoping they do well. But the thing is, what I sometimes feel sad about is that you get these people. I think this is especially prevalent in the UK, actually, where you have some absolutely phenomenal talent. Like I'm talking about, like, you know, like the guys that make the game The Room and things like that. And, you know, it does all right as it's kind of paid up and things like that. But I do sometimes think, like, if they use their resources in a better way, each person on that team could probably afford half of Brighton by now, wherever they're based, because that is their talent on their team.
Dream.
And then not taken away from it, because I get it. Not everyone is financially motivated or anything like that. But it's like, you could get to the situation when then you can truly make the game that you really want to make, because you've got no pressure on having to hit targets. Because I think the saddest thing is when you see sort of talented companies and individuals go bust because they've made a title which just for whatever reason hasn't hit. And that's unfortunately, that's both the good and bad of working in the games industry, right? I think good is that you can come out from absolutely nowhere and you could end up with a monumental bonus or setting yourself up for life because the game just becomes a smash hit phenomenon. If you've ever been lucky enough to work on something like that, it can genuinely be life-changing. But equally, it can be bad because unlike other companies or other industries where you can have a job for life, I mean, I don't think there's a job for life in the games industry right now. You know, be interesting to see if that ever happens in maybe Nintendo or something like that, like a company that's really been around ages. Otherwise, you know, I mean, look at, for example, the Lionhead, bought by Microsoft for tons of money, made Fable, which is a franchise that sold millions of copies, and then now it doesn't even exist. And, you know, that just goes to show you, and, you know, let me tell you, because I've got someone who was at Lionhead as the CTO of my company. I mean, wow, those people know their stuff, right? You're talking, you know, the IQ and intelligence is insane, but a couple of bad titles and it's game over. So how much do you kind of want to risk it? I think in your example, if I was an indie studio and we'd had like a few titles that have been successful, and now we started to have like enough money or revenue coming in where, okay, we're thinking about expanding upwards. So now we've got kind of 10 people and we're stable. And even if we made kind of like 2 or 3 blunders, we'd still be around in a couple of years. But now we're starting to think, yeah, but you know what, how do we get our team to 20 people, to 50 people? I've got this idea for a game that's like some batshit insane, crazy game that, you know, would take up 50 people to make or something like that. Then yes, you might want to get that kind of person involved in it. But then I think with a studio like that, I mean, culturally finding someone that can come in and work with those people is almost going to be impossible, because it's very difficult to find those sort of people who I think you'd be able to find someone who'd understand how to product manage a title, but finding someone who'd be able to come in and understand how an indie team works and be able to get them to accept and move towards this kind of way that you want to go would be very difficult, because it's sort of like fundamentally opposed from a cultural point of view.
Well, I think even if you don't have the money to hire a product manager outright as a small indie, I think there are sensible things that our product manager like that you should be doing. You should do some market research before you actually start making a game to figure out, is the market even there for this? You should ask yourselves the questions of, are we making this game because we're passionate about the vision for it? Or do we see it as a financial opportunity, right? Like, why are you making games? That changes very much the need for a product manager outright. Product managers manage a product, and a product is a business. If you're making a piece that's purely like an artistic interest for you, then you probably don't need a product manager. If you're not concerned with the business results, great, go nuts, fill your creative boots all day long. But I think there are certainly, most indie studios probably can't afford to do that, or if they're doing it, it's kind of a passion project, not their full-time job. So they should be doing product manager type things like market research, like, you know, figuring out like who their competitors are, that kind of stuff early on, rather than just going at it blind.
So as a follow-up to that, and thank you both, do you think that a product manager can be developed from inside a team, such as inside, you know, you can pick someone from the indie team, say, because I'm just thinking back to my experience at PlayStation. There were some senior designers working with me who were absolutely on the money when it came to, they wanted the hooks put in so they could measure the data. They wanted to analyze the data. They wanted to fire up Tableau, whatever it was, and just see what impact their changes were having on their games and where things were difficult for players, etc. Do you think there's a particular personality or background or role where that sort of person can become a product manager?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's happened to myself. I think also, I have to say, I think some of the best people I've worked with tend to have those tendencies, whether they realize it or not. Like, actually, I have to say, we all work together, but I have to say one thing that always impressed me about Callum actually is that even though he's like quote unquote a producer, it's like this guy could just be a DOP and you wouldn't notice the difference. Like, he's asking all the right questions, just naturally curious and asking important questions. Like, our art director actually at our company is like, I jokingly call him the director of products, because sometimes some of the things that he says, I don't think he even realizes that he says it in such a way, but he asks them in such a right way that, he's like curious. He goes, well, is this even making a difference? Like, how many people are even doing this? How many people are even seeing this? I could spend, the next 3 weeks making it look like that or making it animate like that. But do people even look at the animations? Maybe I should just make the front end look nicer instead, etc., etc. So where it comes from is, I think you just got to be people that are think quite logically. There's, you sometimes say like this left side and right side type of thinking with your brain. Some people just naturally like that. But I think the more important is just being curious. So can it come from an indie studio? Absolutely. What I would imagine would happen in a case like that is an indie studio would start doing well. Then they'd start asking themselves some questions going, okay, well, do you know what? We've made 3 updates now. That second update, we doubled our revenue, but the first and third update, we only made like 2% extra. Why is that? Oh, okay. Well, it turned out that, it was the Halloween costumes that made a big difference. Oh, but that's because it was around Halloween and people spend more money anyway. Oh, okay. Well, maybe we should just try making some more scary costumes anyway. Maybe they would have think that the 4th update is scary costumes. Oh, wow. We made 50% extra revenue here. Not the 100% from the previous one, but that's how you should be thinking. And they're your early steps into doing it. Now, of course, that's like, the Fisher Price version of product management. That's where you start at the top before you go all the way to the bottom, when we're talking about this kind of hardcore free-to-play game studio having to make business forecasts and spending your days in Excel projections and, LTV versus ROI calculations and things like that. But you don't have to go that far into it. I think just generally understanding it is good, because then you can bring someone in who could help you get to that final step if you wanted to. But for example, I think what's interesting is that you still sometimes see a lot of investment going on into gaming at the moment, despite being, in a corona pandemic. Look, Zynga bought Peak Games, for example.
It's a frenzy at the moment, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I don't know if I'd say frenzy, but I think I'd say it's super healthy and encouraging for us in the industry. Like, regardless of what happens, I think when you've got to be worried is when you stop hearing these things happening.
It's a good frenzy.
Yeah. Every time I see on gamesindustry.biz that company here has raised X amount of money, company Y has been acquired, that is great for us all, because that is ultimately going to be creating more jobs and more things. When someone gets acquired, then some of those people are going to leave and set up another new studio, which is going to create more jobs. And, you tend to leave companies in this business, but not people. And, I would be, for example, shocked if I didn't end up working with either Liam or Callum again in the future, maybe be 20 years time, maybe, but it happens, right? Good people tend to do that. So, I think, that shows you that sort of thing is going to be important going forward.
Butting in. You said earlier, you both did that a lot of companies closed down, right? I mean, I remember when I started Sony PlayStation, a day before I joined, they were closing one of the studios. And, in the UK, and by the time I left, I think they closed all of them, and I do take that personally. But you know what I mean? It's like, just because something starts doesn't mean to say it's going to be a success story, as you said. And I guess both of you, your point is, if you do want to make a success, you have to make a profit, and you have to understand business as well as bringing your passion and your heart to things. And therefore, a product manager put in the right place or migrated from the right background is a person who can actually help you survive as a company and thrive, right?
Yeah, as I said before, it's about a product manager really is about bringing the risk down on the success of a project. They do that by making sure that it has the best possible return on the investment for you as a business. There is one thing I have an exception to. I generally agree with the point Anil was making about product managers can and often.
Oh, are we going to have a fight, mate?
Maybe we're getting an hour and 20 minutes in now, so it's about time we have one.
Right.
Although I don't think this will be that contentious. I'm pretty sure Anil will agree with me, but let's throw it out there anyway. So I agree with the statement that product managers could and probably should come from within the team. I think actually I prefer working with those, and I think they're better product managers all round than the guys who've come in and never actually made a game or been in their trenches, as it were. The one thing I would have an exception to that on, in my experience at least, is the sub facet of product management of economy design. When it comes to economy design, I actually prefer people who've come in with a pure business sense than people who have a game designing sense, because I think those guys really understand what an economy means. We as gamers tend to look at it as an economy of, or we tend to look at it in a way that kind of doesn't necessarily really deliver against the definition of an economy. We try and gamify it in the design stage rather than letting the data drive the way that the economy should be manifested. So I would always prefer, if a product manager owns an economy, for them to have a business background purely for that reason.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. That's good to have. I think also just realistically, most product managers do not come from a team. I think that's actually far rarer. I would say less than 10% come from a team, if I'm being honest. So you're always going to get them. I think it's more about understanding when someone brings in, just trying to get that right early doors, have everyone go to the pub and get drunk together, understand what makes each person tick as a person, learning to work together so each person becomes closer to understanding what each other does and moving it that way. I think, when you get good PMs that come out of teams, what tends to happen is because there already was like a product person in the company, whatever, and then they've picked up a bit, and then the product person has probably recommended that person could do it, and then they sort of gravitate towards that role. But sometimes you find that happening as well, like game leads, even EPs, they don't always often start just raw from production. They could start from some other angle in the industry, but just naturally their natural, producer leadership. So, if you notice on the team that this person just naturally seems to be the person that everyone listens to, and when he says something and people say, yeah, let's do it that way, and then that decision turns out to be the thing that works, no one's really going to have an argument. I see that happen quite a lot in teams. You get this organic process where the game lead kind of happens by itself.
Yeah.
Can I ask another dumb question? And they are endless, but let's look at. So this has been incredibly interesting, and I kind of want to pick up a few threads and tie them together where you've touched upon things I'd like a little bit more detail from you both. So let's say you're putting together a big budget game. Your team's been working on it for a while, and you're aiming to be a live service, games live service, and all that. You're aiming to go out there, and you're aiming to have longevity, and you're aiming to measure what's going on. And you go, right, okay, so we've had a traditional games team. So let's say it's a PC console title. You've had a traditional games team working on it, and at some point somebody goes, right, it's time to bring in a product manager or product owner. When you do that, you've mentioned this on and off throughout this chat. There can be some problems with, say, having a common lexicon, right? A common language of how you refer to things, or where they're going to come in and maybe tread on some toes. Can you give any advice from your experience of how to smooth that over, and also when you should consider bringing in a product manager? Should it be once you've gone live? Should it be, and Anil, you've talked about this, but should it be months before you go live, etc.?
For me,
that also, you go, Callum. No, you go.
Cool, thank you. For me as a producer, when do you bring in a product manager? As early as it makes sense to, right? At the point where you have a thing that feels like is representative of the product, I think that's when you bring a product manager in. Partly because that then gets you through, that then actually helps with the integration that we're talking about, right? Making them feel like they're part of the team. If they come in earlier, it's much, much easier to make changes to the product if things are going in a different direction or going off track. If they come in earlier, it's much more likely that they'll be around to sort of form those strong bonds with the team, understand how the game is built, which is often a problem product managers have. They don't really understand the time it takes or the processes it takes to get stuff into the game itself. So I would always go for as early as possible. And one thing I would advocate in terms of the integration piece as well, is make sure the team understands the why. I've seen so many cases where company X has decided we're going to hire a product person to lead this product or work on this product. And it's done without the team understanding why. The team feels like they've, or at least I've seen it feel like the team have been told, by proxy, you guys have done a bad job. You can't manage your own product. You can't decide your own destiny. We're bringing someone in to do that for you. And often that's not the case, right? There's just an opportunity to do even better. And I think a lot of companies miss that context setting around why the product manager is coming in and what value they're going to add to the team and why it makes their lives better, etc. And if you can help them understand that, ultimately you're going to have a much better experience when that person comes on board.
Yeah, I really agree with that. That's a really good advice, I think. I would say something similar. I think on those really big titles, you'd want to have someone minimum coming in sort of 6 months before you're going to be going with your game live. But in my honest opinion, I think even as a game starts up, you would want a product person on it from the very get-go, because otherwise you're going to have the mismatch. There you have to get someone who's like very experienced. I mean, here's the thing, right, is that you can't categorize all product people as being the same. What tends to happen when you look for a product manager is you have like a Venn diagram of strengths, and where they lie in them can be different things. So what are those strengths? They should be, good at analysis. They should be good at production. They should actually be good at game design and understanding how to kind of make it. So, you have all these different things. Well, good at leadership as well. People are going to sit on different ends of these spectrums, right? You might get a product manager who actually is very good at game design or understands what makes a good game. That would be like a very good person to have come on early doors in a project that you'd started from the beginning. If you had a product manager though instead who was like, ninja tier in analysis and analytics, but weak on understanding, product market fit or what makes a good game, that would probably not be a good person to have in the beginning, no matter how good they are, because their value is going to be limited. That person then might be really good to bring on sort of 6 months from coming out, because they're just going to get stuck in straight away and understand and move the needle in the right direction. So it depends, sadly, is the answer there. There's no clear-cut cookie answer.
That's very interesting. And I guess, so one of the aspects that's really important for any product manager is stakeholder management, right? They've got to quite quickly move into a new environment, a new company, a new team. And they've got to not only win over the team, but they've got to be aware of their peers. They've got to be aware of where the decisions are made, the senior stakeholders, and they've got to win enough political influence to be able to make really important decisions to change fundamental parts of a game. So you use your data-driven analysis to try and prove things to people and win people over, right? But have you seen that work well, work badly? Have you got any advice for people about that kind of thing, that stakeholder management? Because it's a very vulnerable position. I think product managers are thrust into a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, it's super difficult. I mean, that's going to depend on the individual, but I think you're right in terms of like your goal is to improve the game and get people believing in you. And the way to do that is to get some kind of quick wins. So normally the kind of product manager 101 is, if you come into a new team, is start with something small that can be delivered that will meaningfully move the data in a certain way. That way you can stand in front of the team, and communication is like a huge part of being a product manager. And you can say, so, okay guys, so I asked you to do this and put it into the game, and here's the result. And as you can see, this has increased the revenue or done this or done something out, and there you go. Once you get one or two of those out of the way, people will be like, okay, well, that person, we respect them because they asked us to do that. They had like a very kind of clear objective in it, but it's working and everyone's doing better now. Now, we're moving up out of the rest of the portfolio. This game's, we're not like the pond scum at the bottom that no one talks to. We might not be the shining light, but we might move there, kind of thing. That's how you would do it. Equally, if you ask the team to do lots of things and, it's not making a difference and people disagreed with it, you're going to, here you may not settle in that team and have to move out, and it can happen either way. It depends, because sometimes you can try to make something with the best of intentions and it just doesn't work out anyway. Happens, otherwise, why isn't every game that's ever been made not being Call of Duty, Modern Warfare in terms of numbers, right? No one sets out to make a bad game. It's just, that's just luck of the draw in some respect. That's the advice of a product manager. That's what they'd have to do is, win over the teams and using. I think the one thing that works is that you can cut out the bullshit, like I say. At the end of the day, if you like someone, you don't like them, if you can see that they're offering value, you'll still be happy to have them in your team. If you're offering what seems to be very little value and getting no end result, then people won't like you. I think as well, like the really good product managers on a very tough game, they could even be there. Things aren't working out. They don't work out for quite a while, but the team still believes in them. And then in the end, when they do get the big win, then, that'll be like a superstar sort of one. tricky to get right.
I think one thing I'd throw on there as well, completely agreeing with all of that, is it's very easy to sometimes be like a lazy product manager. You just look at whatever the top grossing game in your genre is in the App Store and be like, well, make the system work like that one. I think the ones I've seen who are the most successful and who break down those barriers that we've talked about previously are the ones who go above and beyond the kind of the cookie cutter implementation approach. They sit down, they'll deconstruct, and this is why Anil's so good at this. They'll deconstruct like why a certain feature or why a certain game has resonated so well with an audience. They'll explain that back to the team in a way that the team can understand. And they'll be able to sort of give you almost like an a la carte menu of like the different features that make up a game's entire feature set, and explain why, copying the guild system from Game of War, but the multiplayer matchmaking system from Clash Royale, but also the control scheme from Game X, they can justify why taking certain proven factors from other games and combining them in your game makes sense. And it's the ones I've seen where they kind of come in and just go, well, just copy that game. They're the ones that tend to get the team instantly very defensive and going, oh, but copying is bad. Like that's not creative. Again, that's partly where the us and them divide comes from.
Good answers, mate. Do you think that one of the problems is that you've inherited a role title, if you're a product manager or product owner, which is very much from software development? Like we have a product to make, let's go make this product. And I think that rubs people who want to make games up the wrong way. Do you think there's a more appropriate job title that might win people over?
There could be, because I have to say that's why at one company they ended up calling us producers instead. I also think that at the different companies that I've been at, what people even mean by a product manager is very different. Like I've definitely seen some companies where you are actually expected to really drive quite in detail the design of things, like coming up with things like guild systems and event systems like that. In others, it would be the complete opposite of that. You were there, I think, sometimes almost to be like a data scientist, that you're actually expected just to be in Tableau all day and kind of presenting your evidence that way. So it is what you make of it. I think that's got to be something that you should ask the company that you're about to join, what are the expectations, and also find it within the team. And I think, like I say, you got to say it's like a versatile role, same as a producer, and you figure out what the best things are each one is and how to offer value in those ways. Because it might be that on different game or different teams, you're using different parts of the Venn diagram than you would for another one. It's not always going to be the exact same rinse and repeat thing that you do each time.
Yeah, I think there's also a loaded term when you use the word manager in someone's job title, where the title is product manager. They actually manage the product. But I think people hear the word manager and assume that it means they are like the manager of everyone on the team, like they are ultimately the person who is responsible for everything. And to your question, Liam, I think that title should change. Things like data scientist or product analyst, those kind of titles, for me, feel more like they're actually indicative of what the product manager role usually does. Like product managers often aren't managers of people, for example. So I feel like that's a better reflection in terms of team expectation setting. But I think also we're in that weird situation now where product manager within the product family, or the product family sort of out there in the recruitment market, has its own set of expectations around what that role means. And if you started calling it anything different, like a data analyst or a data scientist, that would have a different meaning and a different set of skills that product managers then wouldn't be interested in even looking at the resume for. So we're in that kind of we're in that fun situation now where the role is kind of established for good or for bad in terms of it being called product manager, and to change it probably means that you can't recruit for that role anymore because people have a different expectation of what that role is.
Let's say Callum is thinking, you know what, I've been a producer for long enough. I sure as hell would like to be a product manager. That sounds like a great career move for me. Have you seen, but do you think there's particular areas of self-education or training that a producer, for example, could get that would make them a good product manager, or anyone, in fact, forget about producer, but anyone? Are there specific courses or training or exposure out there that you would recommend?
Well, I think certainly I think every good producer should be product aware. We live in a world now where I don't think you can be blind to the fact that the games we make are products, and they have to have a certain level of measurability and a certain level of accountability to their KPIs at the end of the day. So I think any good producer, if they're doing their job well, because they're ultimately responsible for the quality of the product, the budget they've got in their control, which will increase if the ROI looks good, and the ROI is driven by the financials coming in, the bottom line that the game generates. I think producers should be product aware. And once they go that next step beyond that, in terms of actually being the person who's in control of those KPIs, a lot of that you'd probably pick up quite organically, or at least certainly for me, I've done that quite organically through the course of my career and being around other product people. Specific training courses, yeah, there are some. You can go and learn how to use certain tools like Tableau. You can go and train in how to do things like writing your own SQL queries and getting comfortable with the actual technical data that powers the back end. You could spend time looking at different analytics solutions on the marketplace, or different ways of sort of measuring analytics output or middleware that can do that. But I think the key thing really is just having the right curious mindset that Anil was talking about earlier. And you can't teach that curiosity. I hope that most producers have that curiosity, but I don't think you can teach that. And that fundamentally is what makes a good product manager tick, is that curiosity around why the players have done a certain thing and why that's triggered a certain change in the game metrics.
Yeah, I was going to say the one thing I think on an actual practical level, there's something called gopractice.io. And that particular site actually has, I guess, like the nuts and bolts of like if you're on it, you literally have like simulators which you can use to dig into, like, it's fake data, but it's essentially giving you the homework of what was involved in doing it. So if you really wanted to do that, it kind of depends on the company, because again, some companies, a product manager, they are actually not expected to by hand sift through the data themselves. You'd have data scientists and things like that. You would actually be asking the questions, and that team would come back and help you kind of do it. Other companies, for example, Zynga, they would expect you to get down and dirty with being able to do it, which, to be fair, is one of the reasons why they produce really good ones, because they tend to have these like sort of Swiss Army knife people that can do everything. And I think that is great, right? If you can manually yourself dig into the data and find out that something is or isn't working, or present an opportunity, then, some literally, if you want to do that, they want to see, well, how many years experience have you got as a product manager? Because they want to see that you've got the skills to do it. Otherwise, if you wanted to transition from one company to another as a producer to be a product manager, they might just say no straight from the off, because you would not have those skills. So, you might need to do some sort of courses to say that you can navigate way around the SQL database, or, write queries and have done it and things like that. So that's like a simulator that would at least give you a taste for it. And you might be like, okay, I don't want to go anywhere near this. Or maybe you'll think, yes, it is something that I like. That said, I think it is definitely possible to become a product manager without having to have too much experience in doing that. You can just be more kind of running it. But look, I guess like the same way we were saying earlier, how we think it's good practice for a product manager to understand how a game is put together. Equally, I would say it's good practice for someone who wants to understand what a product management role is to have had some experience of sifting through data and doing that themselves, because you're going to get taken more seriously, right? I've actually seen that in some teams before, where someone who isn't a product manager has actually looked through the data and presented something using it. And when you do that, you think, wow, okay, this person is like taking it to another level, because they're now back in their argument. They're fighting the product manager on their own terms, sort of thing,
I wonder, do you think a product manager would help empower an indie if they have a relationship with a publisher? Because the publisher may be tempted to tell an indie a lot of things about, having an external producer who will say, you should do this, you should do that, and a product manager could kind of empower the team the other direction and say, well, actually, here's the data-driven stuff here. Have you ever seen that before? Have you seen? Maybe we both have some experience there.
I've seen it happen in a very odd sense, where actually the indie developer didn't have a data platform themselves, but it was the publisher who had the data platform, and it was their analysts, and it was their essentially their equivalent of a product person who was doing the analysis and figuring out what good looked like and what the KPIs were telling us, and then feeding that into the dev team. And that sort of disconnect we were talking about, that us and them, was so stark there, because it was literally an external company telling the game team, here's what your data looks like, here's what that means, here's how you should react to that, and having no real kind of common parlance or common level of understanding with the game team themselves. And that was honestly one of the worst situations I've seen in terms of a publisher-developer relationship. It quite quickly went south, and I don't think that game ever actually saw the light of day with that publisher. It came out a few years later with a different publisher.
I was going to say, sadly, I think most of the times I've seen it tried have not ended up very well, because normally it's such a cultural break. But what does tend to happen is you will get actually more I guess they become the publisher, but it's more like a company will invest in someone. They'll be like, here's like a highly creative studio, but so where this kind of balance will come is you might have like a publisher or owner who are like, okay, we need to make more games, but we're not that actually good at making brand new games. We're like more of an efficient machine at making the ones that we've got already make money, but not coming up with a new idea. So here's a studio who's like really good at making new ideas, and they've got a particular game or idea that we think is really good, and we think that that game, we could turn it into like a massive property. Like we could turn it from making 10 million a year into 100 million a year, a billion a year, if they had some kind of product management on there. So they end up buying a company, then they'll mandate that like a director of product comes in, and then they'll kind of work with that team to try and get it working. I have seen that happen mainly, and I've seen it work successfully as well. The main reason I've seen it work successfully is, if I'm being honest, is that then the publisher either just says, well, it's our way or the highway, you've got to deal with it. Or perhaps more likely because they've got enough kind of like financial backing that they can afford for it to take quite a while and find the right ingredients and the right person to slowly get it there over time, and slowly transition that studio away from being so sort of indie driven and being more into a kind of like, profit center type of, because normally what happens when you're looking at that level is you can have cost centers and profit centers, and that's the idea there. I mean, that would happen. Like if EA buys a certain studio, they're going to want that studio to ultimately start making money and pay back the amount that was invested to buy it in the first place. If they've spent, how much did they buy the guys that made Titanfall? Was it like 650 million or something like that? So if they've spent that much getting those devs, then obviously they're going to be on like a 10-year plan to make that back. Otherwise it doesn't make commercial sense to buy that studio in the first place. So in the case like that, then it would probably work that way, and you'd get there slowly over time. But then I would say, really what's happened is that the studio's lost a lot of their personality because they've been bought at that point in time. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and they've done well out of it, but now they are just another cog in the machine.
Let's take an example of a game that considers itself as going to be going out there live, but actually the game will ship and then it will sell, I don't know, say a season's worth of downloadable content, and then that's basically the plans. Does that need a product manager versus a game that's going to be selling constant microtransactional model of, say, having lots and lots and lots of content and people can buy what they want? Are there models that work and don't work that require or don't require a product manager?
I mean, you're essentially describing the traditional console and PC DLC update kind of pattern there, right? Like where every quarter they'll throw out a new pack, some new content, for example. And yes, I think they do need a product manager. I think the product manager can look at what the players are doing in the existing product, where they're spending their most time, which things they're engaging with the most, and helping to use that data to inform the future DLC updates, the future content drops that you put out. So even if you are only doing sort of like every half a year or every quarter cadence updates, at least it's got the maximum chance of being something the users will give a damn about.
Yeah, I think in the first example you gave there, Liam, you probably don't even need a product manager. You can just have like a data analyst or something looking at it. I think product manager is more for a live service game, if I'm being honest. It's something where you're, and also like it depends on how you work, because some of those bigger games aren't working in a sprint cycle. They might work more in a milestone cycle, although I think that's kind of gone the way of the dinosaur, if I'm being honest. I think most people work sprints this way. But I think if you're not delivering something frequently, there isn't really the need for one, because they're going to have limited impacts in terms of what they could do. You can just use an analysis team instead.
Now, you've said, both of you, a product manager probably is coming in later, but as early as possible, but later. Do you think there's a world in which the product manager is involved in the creation of a new product using their data-driven knowledge?
100%. I think that totally exists, and it's not a bad thing. Product managers, they are looking for opportunities to make products. So they're very close to things like market data research or player insights research, understanding what players are looking for, and helping to find those next big things on paper before you've even written a line of code in the software side. So yeah, I think they can and should exist earlier on, not necessarily in the form of like a product manager against a product, but certainly doing analysis type work to try and find out where the next opportunity might come from.
Yeah, I have to say, in the case of my own company, I mean, that's literally what happened, is that we came to a case where we started making some prototypes for some games. We had some that the team particularly liked. Then it's my role to sort of say, well, okay, is this even worth making this game? What is the market opportunity? As Callum was mentioning earlier, what are the competitors in the space? What's the total addressable market? How much do we think we can make? Is it worth us spending 6 months, a year of our time making this if, the top amount you can make every month is 20 grand? Probably not, right? Because that's more than it costs to fund the team, et cetera. And then, actually as happened this one, I came up with the idea of one specific prototype that we made, and then we came there to market. But that prototype was informed. I think we should make this game because I think there's an opportunity in this space. So you can definitely get people like that. And, but it doesn't have to be that person. But yes, I think that's why you would get someone right from the beginning to kind of validate that from the very get-go. As Callum says, once you've got a game idea, just the theme of the game can be huge, right? You could make it horror theme, you could make it fantasy theme, you could make it sci-fi, you could make it, cyberpunk. And then you might see, it turns out that if we're trying to make an FPS, but make the enemies look like candies and sweets, it isn't going to work as well as if, it's very boyish.
Zombie candies and sweets.
Well, there you go, right? Well, that's what happens. But then, same time, look at Nintendo. They made Splatoon, and they found that there was a way to make a kind of slightly more mass market shooter by diluting down the violence and things like that. You could say the same with Fortnite. Like, one of the reasons why Fortnite appeals to such a younger demographic is they spent a long time on that art style, making it very accessible and broad appeal.
Okay, well, these are supposed to be quick questions. So I'll interrupt you. Thank you. How important is a good relationship between a product manager and the marketing department? It's
essential. If we look at the industry now, as product managers own the commercial success of titles, on mobile particularly, especially free-to-play type titles, your marketing team basically can sink or swim your project. If you're spending $20 to buy every user in and it's only making $10 back, then a disconnect has happened somewhere and you might as well just throw it all in the bin. So I think it's an essential relationship. I know it's meant to be a quick answer, but I just want to throw in here as well. I hate when that relationship goes so far the other way, though, that product puts so much pressure on the UA cost that the UA becomes disingenuous to the product. I'm sure we've all seen those adverts for mobile games where the advert looks a certain way, then you click on it and go to the App Store and you're like, this is not even the genre of game the advert was describing. So I think there's an important relationship, but don't let it go so far that the tail is wagging the dog.
Do you think that there needs to be re-education of certain traditional game making companies when it comes to things like not just product management, but user acquisition, which is a thing? I mean, I've mentioned it a few times now, user acquisition, just because I've noticed that in certain parts of the industry, people just have never even heard of it. Don't really understand that there would even be such a thing.
Yeah, I'll take this if you don't mind. Absolutely. I try and do that whenever I've gone to a company because I think it's insane actually how little is done it. And I think to myself as well, when I first started in the games industry, I guess because it was so sort of old school, you just left to your own devices. No one explains to you how it quote unquote works, which I think is really important. Yes, you are doing it as a passion industry, but it's a business, right? A business exists for what reason? It's to make money. I hate to be, kind of cynical like that, but it's true. So how is this whole organization set up so we can make something that's amazing, creative, cool, but also makes money at the end of the day? I think the difference I've noticed in people when you spend the time to explain to them how it works and not in a kind of, making them feel stupid way and just an intelligent, this is why it's important that each team performs their function way is incredible. Then people feel that they're along for the journey, that they understand what they need to do. They might even come up with good ideas to improve the overall process.
Yeah, second all of that. Absolutely.
I need to ask my favorite question, which is, which question do you wish I had asked you?
I wish you had asked us what our thoughts were on the recent announcement that loot boxes are actually gambling.
And what would you answer if I had asked you that?
That I couldn't agree more. Gacha must die, and I would love to see a world where that didn't necessarily have to exist.
Anil, do you agree with that?
What, with the whole gambling thing?
Well, with what Callum just said, his answer was to the loot boxes.
I actually don't mind them. I do agree. I can see why people have taken that stance. I mean, I would then say, well, what about Panini stickers or Kinder eggs or things like that, right? When you buy a Kinder egg for a child, the prize you get inside it is random. That's a gacha. Is that gambling? That said, I definitely do think that loot boxes need to be controlled and regulated in some way, because I've seen firsthand, unfortunately, some companies do some devious things around them. But I think, it's been proven that people enjoyed them. So if there's like a way you can do it without people overly spending, I think it's a fine mechanic.
I think the key difference is you can't buy a £90 Kinder Egg.
Yeah, you could spend £90 on 90 Kinder Eggs.
You could. You just couldn't buy one for 90 quid. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
We're going to forever remember this as the Kinder Egg controversy.
Yes.
and Anil, what do you wish I'd asked you?
I don't have one for that, because I think we touched on the biggest thing. I think it's just important to sort of say what are the differences between the two roles and how they can work together. And I think we answered that one pretty well.
I think we did dwell, and I hope it's okay that we did, but we dwelled upon the product manager role more than about, the producer relationship. I think just because I'm talking to a lot of producers, and you're the first kind of product manager. And I know you've got experience with product management, but you're the first that we've purely talked about there. So I really wanted to cover it in a bit more detail, and I'm glad I did, I'm glad that you did, because I've massively enjoyed listening to you both, and just sitting back and wallowing in the knowledge and wisdom that you have has been extremely enjoyable.
I would touch on a point just lastly that we just mentioned about the whole kind of re-education thing. Like, I just think that's generally a good practice in any industry to do that. Like, I think it's interesting that, I think it's not a surprise that we've ended up talking more about a product manager on this podcast, because everyone who's going to be listening to it is familiar with games production. They might not be familiar with what a product manager does. So if that's the case, any organization, why not try and make that abundantly clear to all of the invested parties right from the very get-go? I don't think there's any harm that can come out of that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think actually, as we see the roles of producer and product manager interacting a lot more and intersecting a lot more, the wider audience for your website, Liam, having more of an understanding of how that role works and how it integrates with production, I think it's absolutely right that we deep dive on product management.
I want people to be able to see it as a piece of career progression, an optional piece of career progression as well. I want them to be able to understand that it's yet another arrow in your quiver that you can start learning about that stuff. Because I've met a lot of producers like you, Callum, like Anil said that you're a perfect example of this, who are just really quite happy to be obsessed with data. And one thing that I find as a producer is wherever I go, it's very difficult to get people to understand how to prioritize by looking at the value of a thing. And of course, a product manager comes in with that kind of headset of that thinking process of saying, well, actually, I look at value. I look at what we're going to be delivering and how valuable that's going to be. And that's how I know if something is important or not. And that's how I look at my backlog. And I think it's really interesting and valuable, if you'll forgive me, that they have that kind of almost natural way of looking at things that's then backed up through their knowledge and experience on the job. So it's a very interesting role and a very interesting new role. And also, I'm really grateful to you both because you've explained a lot about that role and the interaction between production and product. But you've done so in such a way where I hope it's cleared up for people who have come in going, oh, it's just an agile product owner. It's not. It's something really a lot different. This is not like a software role.
Yeah, totally.
So thanks, guys. I really appreciate your time, and it's lovely to get the old gang back together, eh?
I know.
There really is. Yeah, thanks for having us over. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you. Look forward to seeing you guys in the flesh at some point post-lockdown.
Thanks for listening. As always, we really appreciate your thoughts and feedback about the show. You can reach out to us by visiting game-production.com's podcast pages and leaving comments under each episode. We have a Facebook group and YouTube channel that you can find linked from the website. If you want to contribute or fancy a chat in the future, we'd love to hear from you.